We will celebrate our alliance this week, the 75th anniversary, but we will also make decisions for the future on deterrence and defense, ensuring that we have the forces, the readiness, the capabilities we need to continue to deter any aggressor, and also ensure that allies continue to carry their fair share of the burden. And we have good numbers. 23 allies are now spending at least 2% of GDP on defense, up from only 3 allies when we made the pledge back in 2014.
That was NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg at the Pentagon yesterday. The 75th NATO summit kicks off today in Washington, D.C. The war in Ukraine will be a major topic among NATO allies, and yesterday, Russia launched a wide-scale missile attack across Ukraine, which caused massive damage to a children's hospital in Kyiv. Video of the aftermath shows emergency crews trying to dig survivors out of the rubble of the destroyed building. Ukraine's security service has accused Russia of launching a missile directly at the hospital. Russia denying that, saying the damage was caused by a falling air defense missile launched by Ukraine. Joining us now, senior fellow at the Washington think tank, the Atlantic Council, Ian Brzezinski, and staff writer at The Atlantic, Anne Applebaum. And we'll give Katty Kay the first question. Katty?
And let me start with you. I mean, a year or so ago, we were looking at the situation in Ukraine and seeing this as a moment of validation for NATO. NATO had been kind of in the doldrums. We had Sweden and Finland joining the alliance. And as you look at it today, and those images from that hospital attack are just heartrending. And you look at Russia's position in Ukraine, and you look at some of the political fractions within NATO. How does NATO, as it celebrates its 75th birthday, how is it standing and looking to you?
So the point of this summit is going to be to show Putin that NATO will remain unified. And I think despite the various, political headwinds that you've just described, despite the recent election in France, despite what's happening in the United States, I think it's incredible how unified the alliance is. The idea is to put some money into a basket for the future. What NATO needs to do now is deter Russia and show that there will be a price to pay for continuing the war. And of course, there will be a price to pay if the war spreads farther. And that's really the purpose of this summit. Remember that this war is a kind of psychological game. Putin is actually running out of soldiers. He's losing equipment. He can't keep doing this forever. What he's trying to do is hold on just long enough for NATO to break up. And the point of the summit is to show that it won't.
Richard, Sam Stein here. I mean, the backdrop of all this, of course, is what we were talking about earlier in the show, which is Joe Biden and his inability at this juncture to inspire confidence, both domestically and on the world stage. You know, we've seen European diplomats basically act as if he will not be president by next year. I'm wondering if you're picking that up too, and just sort of how that colors this summit. Do people who support Ukraine sense that there is a shortened window here to get something done or even produce some sort of resolution, because Trump may very well come back into power come January?
Sam, you're right. The reality of this summit is there's the formal agenda and there's the real agenda. The formal agenda is the bridge to the future for Ukraine. There'll be talk about greater European defense effort. That's all necessary. And by the way, there's a lot to celebrate with NATO at 75. It's been history's most remarkable, successful alliance. But there is a but. One is the ghost or specter of Donald Trump hovers over the proceedings, in part because Trump is a candidate who, unlike most presidential candidates, indeed any presidential candidate in the modern era, doesn't share any of the foreign policy consensus. Any other candidate who's imaginable just about would be a supporter of NATO. He's not, and people there can read the polls. And there's also real concern about President Biden. So people at the summit are going to be putting him under a microscope to watch everything he does and says and how he walks and all that. But essentially, they're looking for reassurance. The hidden consensus is they would overwhelmingly prefer continuity, and they're frightened of change. Let me, though, turn it to Ian. I haven't yet, it's one of the Brzezinskis I haven't disagreed with this morning, so I think it's important to spread it around the the family. What do you think NATO is prepared to do do you think it's prepared to do enough, either on the amount of spending, but also on how the money is spent? NATO spends a lot of money if you add up all the national budgets, but the whole is less than the sum of its parts. You don't get that amount of collective defense effort. How serious are the Europeans about a collective European defense effort?
Well, thanks, Richard, and it's good to see you, and it's good to see Mika and Joe and Ann, of course. Let me just say that, those pictures we saw, those were war crimes committed by the Russians. That is unjustified brutality. And at this summit, the key issue is how is the alliance going to respond? Will it present a strategy that will enable Ukraine to win quickly, decisively, and on its terms? And to your question, does NATO have the resources to apply it? I'm not entirely convinced this summit is going to provide that strategy or the resources. They're talking about shifting the contact group that provides security assistance from U.S. control to NATO control. That's useful and helpful, but not decisive. They're talking about NATO doing more training outside of Ukraine. Helpful, but not decisive. They're talking about $40 billion just over the next year. Uncertain what will happen after 2025. That's helpful, but not decisive when it comes down to enabling Ukraine to do what is necessary to win on its terms and quickly. Because time is not on Ukraine's side in this war. There's just too much of an imbalance of economic and military power between Ukraine and Russia. This is a moment for the alliance to act with decision. And it's underscored by the fact of the atrocities that Russia is committing against Ukrainians just yesterday.
Yeah. So, Ann, earlier this morning, talked about a Wall Street Journal op-ed piece by Jerry Baker about how Labor won a crushing victory in part because populists and conservatives couldn't become aligned in Britain. You're right. Your piece is absolutely fascinating and a lesson that, a critical lesson going back to what you've been writing about for years, and that is how to defeat populism. And you talk about two types of populism, actually, that Labor was able to defeat. How did they do it?
So, and this is relevant to the NATO summit, too, of course. What the Labour Party did was reform itself, and led by Keir Starmer, who's now the prime minister, they moved it away from far left positions that it had under the previous leader, Jeremy Corbyn, who lost a couple of elections with those. They moved it not just to the center, but they moved it to economic, local, domestic issues. So schools, hospitals, what people think about when they wake up in the morning. They tried to reconnect it with ordinary voters. They talk about working people. They talk about service. You can hear it in all of their language. And every Labor politician that I met last week, everybody that I interviewed uses the same kind of language. And at the same time, they use that language to fight the legacy of the previous Tory governments who had used populism, nationalism, fear of immigrants to create a kind of hysteria about the need to, for Britain to defend itself, remove itself from Europe, remove itself from institutions. And by refocusing on what people care about, and by saying they want to show that Labour is a reliable partner, it's a part of the world, we're going to trade normally with our neighbors. By doing that, they made Labour a trustworthy party again, and they won. And it's not an exact parallels of the U.S. at all. It's a different voting system and so on. But that instinct that what really matters is how we talk to people, why they should vote for us, making yourselves electable in the best possible sense is a way to defeat both this kind of sometimes madness on the left, as well as the really dangerous right-wing populism that we now have everywhere.
So, Ian, I guess the counterpoint again in the American example to what Anne was outlined there is that the Republican Party has basically abandoned the sort of, traditional conservative neoliberal economic agenda and gone full in on the populism. And yet the polls going into the election here in the UK showed Labour way ahead. The polls in the US show the Republican Party, and its standard bearer Donald Trump and Joe Biden, almost neck and neck, and continue to do that. Did the American voting public, traditional Republican public, have they jettisoned those kind of conservative principles of economics as well, unlike voters in the UK? Or do you think we're going to see something in November that suggests more of a UK model?
You know, when you look at polling, it's clear that the MAGA elite leaders, Donald Trump and his senior advisors, bring a certain nativism to their policies and their outlook, for example, on NATO, since we have this summit coming up. But when you look at polling broadly, including in the Republican Party, most Americans are actually very transatlantic in their outlook. There was polling just came out from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. 80% of Americans think we ought to sustain our commitment to NATO or improve it. Mark Thiessen had a great piece in the Washington Post reporting on Ronald Reagan Institute's recent polling that focused very much on the MAGA population, those who support Donald Trump. They're actually very transatlanticist in outlook. So when you look forward, whoever wins this election is going to be resting on an American population that's internationalist in outlook and is very committed to NATO. Now, what the elite does in that context is a little bit uncertain. We'll see, and it'll depend on what the election is. If it's Biden, it'll be continuity. If it's Trump, even with this American outlook, we could have a rocky time in the alliance.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.